Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all joining us today for the next installment in our Operationalizing Locally Led Development webinar series. My name is Jenna Thoritz, and I'm Senior Manager for Global Initiatives here at Humentum. Very happy to have you all joining us for this really interesting conversation all about flipping the script on funding. While we go ahead and get started, I just want to take the opportunity to thank our industry partners. These are folks that support Humentum and support our members in providing services that benefit all of us in our work. And their support also makes these kinds of events possible. So I just wanted to give them a thanks first. And then just some very, very quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will be, monitoring that throughout the event. Sam, our moderator, will be weaving some of them in throughout. And if we have time at the end, we'll go into a more structured Q&A. So definitely keep those questions coming. And we love to see an active chat. So feel free to have, your own sidebar conversations there. Subtitles are available. You can turn on closed captioning in the bottom bar of your Zoom. It'll say CC, and that's what you click to turn on closed captioning. And we are recording this event, so you can expect a follow-up email in just a few days, and you'll be able to access that. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our fabulous panel. We have Sam, Taryn, and Madonna, and I will turn it over to Sam to get us started.
Thank you so much, Jenna. So it's wonderful to see you all here, and I'm really delighted to be moderating this session today. My name is Samantha Musoke. I'm from the UK, but I've lived in Uganda for 23 years. I have to say, for my sins, I'm a passionate accountant. That's what I'm most known for. And I have been working in the nonprofit sector for all my professional life, really, the last 20, 30 years. And right now, I am the director for a project with a pretty terrible name. Bear with it, IFR for NPO, but with an amazing mission, which is harmonizing accounting and accounting standards for nonprofit organizations. So I'm really excited about this conversation of flipping the switch on funding. And I think we've got two really interesting lenses that unusual lenses that we're bringing to this conversation today. One about financial accountability and how that can flip the switch on funding. And also this locally led development CSO lens. Rather than just talking to funders, let's talk to the receivers and different shapes and types of philanthropy going on in the sector. So I'm really excited for this conversation today. I'll tell you a bit more about the IFR for NPO project as we go along, I think, as the occasion arises. I'm delighted that we have two fantastic panelists. We have Taryn Ray, who's the Chief Executive Officer from the Tomorrow Trust in South Africa. And we have Madonna Ainembabazi, from the who is the philanthropy program lead at CSOs Africa, who's together with me in Uganda. So I'd love to give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves and tell us briefly who you are, and also what's your take. Well, no, we'll come to that, but just briefly introduce yourself first, if that's all right. Taryn, should we start with you?
Sure. Yep. Good afternoon. My name is Taryn Ray, as you had mentioned, CEO of the Tomorrow Trust. We are a nonprofit based in South Africa. I have got 15 years experience within the NGO sector, managing various programs, focusing on fundraising specifically for the organization that we're at right now. I also have assumed the responsibility of leading Tomorrow Trust of last year, so fairly new within my position. So Tomorrow Trust is an NGO headquartered in Johannesburg, South Africa. We support about 1,500 beneficiaries, and our mission is focused on addressing the persistent inequalities in education, particularly for marginalized and vulnerable children and youth. And with saying that, we develop and implement comprehensive educational programming aimed at bridging that educational gap to our beneficiaries.
That's fantastic. That's really helpful perspective and background so that we kind of know where you were coming from. Brilliant. Madonna, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
First, thank you, Samantha, and it's a pleasure having you all on this call. My name is Madonna Vicky Ainembabazi, and I lead the philanthropy program at CSOs Africa. CSOs is currently located in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa, and it exists as, I would say, a consortia of 3 entities: CSOs itself, Civ Fund, which is our Afrofeminist grant-making arm, and Civ Legacy Foundation that implements our non-profit work. All of us are in, yes, it's sort of 3 entities in one, but we are driving towards the same mission of supporting local and African philanthropy. And our vision is philanthropy that works and civil society that thrives. So we exist for civil society. They are the reason that we advance the different initiatives that we have, advocating for better funding practices and all in our context. And in this position, we've experienced sort of in both instances, the injustices and inequities of the current funding landscape, but we've also tested and tried new ways of funding through our funding arm. So I would say there's a lot of shape shifting in terms of the way that I come into this conversation as funder and funded. I'm not a funder myself, but I work for a funding organization. Yes, it's important to split the 2 personalities. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we've got some really interesting perspectives. I'm really looking forward to hearing. So 5 minutes, Taryn, if you wanted to sort of, what do you think about flipping the switch on funding? What would you think would be the key things that we need to do to flip the switch from where you're sitting?
So I think the topic of flipping the script of fundraising or funding is intriguing, and this week it had me thinking. And in my experience in the sector, there's always these same key questions that often come up. And it often revolves around, how do we access more funding? How do you scale and find funding to match? How do you build reserves that ensure sustainability? And even more critical now is, how do we transform the approach to our funders' contribution? Recognizing that NGOs require operational funding, and the need to build reserves to navigate challenges like what we've had with post-COVID is just as important. So for me, that was my thoughts around flipping the script of funding, and the questions that I was thinking around and posing and really trying to get to a practical solution around. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I can see some really, I don't know if that's, I think Taryn might have stopped for a moment there. Super. So I can see some really big themes here that I'm sure will resonate with lots of us: accessing funding, scaling, getting the funding for that, building reserves, those magical pots of backup, and transforming the funding approach, making sure that funders are funding the full costs. So some really important conversations there. Brilliant. Over to you, Madonna. 5 minutes. What are the top headlines that you think about when you're flipping the script? I talked about flipping the switch. I think we're flipping the script on funding.
Yes. Thank you, Samantha. So when I think about flipping the script on funding, it's hard for me not to think about it away from the decolonial approach or decolonizing aid, especially given the context that I'm coming from, which is the global South. And it's hard to take, when you talk about aid or funding, it's hard to take out the colonial history element of it. And I refer to Professor Sylvia Tamale's book that defined what decolonizing was as a process of understanding the manifestations of coloniality and then proceeding to counter them. So flipping the script on funding would necessitate us understanding funding as it stands at the moment, the funding system, the practices in there, the powers that be and the power that is not recognized, and proceeding to sort of take all of that apart and counter it through reimagining, through really just going on a quest of alternatives is what I usually refer to. And I think it's a process that is deeply reflective, and in our experience at CSOs Africa, as we've been championing decolonizing aid work, we've had several conversations with NGOs, INGOs, CBOs, and individual activists around decolonizing aid and the experiences of philanthropy, of funding, and I'm using these words in a very conflicted manner. I won't get into, I'll just assume that we're using them in the broadest sense of the terms. In this process, for us, we employed Edgar Villanueva's approach of decolonizing through healing, first acknowledging the trauma of what we've experienced in this funding system, that we get to talk about it, that we point out the wrongs, and then we proceed to listen to those whose voices have not been heard in this process, and then get into the reparations. And reparations not necessarily being, send all the money, no restrictions or something, but acknowledging that the money that has been advanced in the international development space has caused harm. So how do we proceed to use money in a way that does not advance further harm? That's what flipping the script for me would look like, decolonizing, essentially.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Madonna. And there's so much, there's so much within that, isn't there? I wanted to bring some of my perspectives on the financial reporting to what you've been saying. Some really interesting things. So if we think about restricted funding, it's basically gifts with strings, right? Here's some money, but it's got to be used X, Y, Z. And inherent in restricted funding is a power inequality. I have the power to give you money and say, but you can only use it for X, Y, Z. And it's really interesting that the whole sort of accounting history of restricted funding comes from the UK and the US. It is absolutely linked to those countries. We've been engaging with accountants and accounting thinkers and accounting philosophers all over the world. New Zealand is a great example where they do not have restricted fund accounting as part of their practice, because restricted giving doesn't happen. There's a much bigger, much more equality in the community. Restricted giving isn't a thing. If I support you, I give the money to you because I support what you're doing. And that was a real eye-opener for me, coming from a UK background, growing up as an accountant. I wasn't an accountant child, don't worry. But as a professional, learning about accountancy and restrictions being sort of just such a normative thing, coming across entire countries where it's not normal because they don't have the same level of power imbalance, was really fascinating to me. And it's been part of the conversation as we've been developing this international standard. How do we bring a new, we mustn't just copy paste the power dynamics and the narratives from the North and from what's been normative. That's been really interesting. Super. And I just wanted to also just speak to Taryn, so you dropped off, but to speak to some of the things that you mentioned and how, again, an accounting lens, because people don't often wake up and think, how does accounting fit into this? But this is my space. Building reserves, as you mentioned, is so important. And for many organizations, it's not that easy to work out what are their reserves. We've been training at Humentum, and I was doing training at Mango before that. And people would often come to me with their financial statements and say, well, how much are my reserves? It's like, oh, well, you can't really tell from your financial statements because it's not your bank balance, because it's got to be your current, your sort of money that you can access, not your fixed assets and not restricted. And you sometimes can't tell. And one of the things we're doing with this accounting standard is bringing more transparency to reserves. So you can look at the financial statements and say, oh, that's what the reserve levels actually are in a defined international way, so that everybody can look at you can see what your reserves are, and what you measure, you can hopefully achieve and understand. And we can have more transparency between funders and grantees about what those reserves are. So I think that's quite an important area. And then you also talked about funds, yes, about getting appropriate coverage for different costs, and how funders often, the funders sometimes aren't able to or don't cover the full costs of projects. We're also hoping with INPAG, which is the guidance that we're creating, to have more transparency about what are support costs, what are the real actual costs of running different projects and running the organization as a basis for better negotiations. So I just wanted to throw those in, how accounting and finance can actually really speak to some of these issues as well. So I want to give you, open up to Taryn, and I'd love you to share some of your experiences in a bit more depth. You talked about long-term financial sustainability, and we know that that is a real challenge, especially in the context of, you know, these short-term project-based grants where it's the direct costs plus 5%. How do you build reserves in that context? It's really, really difficult. And it's inadequate to fully cover the costs of an organization's work. So really interested to hear, for the Tomorrow Trust, how has your journey to greater financial sustainability pushed you to, you know, flip the switch and seek alternative funding mechanisms to get out of this sort of trap of short-term underfunded project-based funding? I'd love to hear your story there.
Yes, definitely. So I do agree with you, Sam. I think, you know, to understand accounting principles and financial management goes hand in hand. Like, you cannot do funding without completely understanding your accountings and your financial standing at this point. I've met a lot of organizations that have come and they've seek counsel and advice in terms of how do you get to that. And when you ask and you say, you know, what is your income looking like? What is your basic principles? There's no understanding for that. So it is so important that we use a mentorship stance to try and help people understand that point first of all, because that is, I think, the entry point into funding and getting successful funding. The combination that we have used as Tomorrow Trust is understanding the importance of financial management, donor relations, partner relations, building long-term partnerships is very important. Trust, transparency is equally important, and I'll go through each one of them as I talk. So for us, it starts with the funder. And I think building partnerships is based on looking at mutual understanding and outlining expectations completely. And we listen and we hear how we align well with the funder and deliver in terms of what we have said we were going to do. And that involves continuous communication, sharing successes and challenges, aligning goals with their sustainable impact. And we have found that our retention of our partners are likely to stay is high because they are likely to stay seeing that there's an outcome to it. Now, adding the financial reporting and the accountability on that adds that extra bit of added trust to the organization. And with Tomorrow Trust over the last 19 years that we've been in existence, I mean, our retention rate of partners is quite high. It's about 95% at this stage. And it is because we have a transparent reporting system. We are transparent and with our financial approach. And that, I think, builds that trust and alignment with our current partners. And again, that then fosters long-term relationships with our funders based on mutual and understanding. We also look at trying to diversify our income. So it's not only relying on donors or funders or corporate South Africa. We also look at flexible funding models. So how do we encourage other creative ways of sourcing incomes? And we were fortunate enough to actually go through Umentum's the sustainable consultation last year, at the end of last year. And this gave us an insight in terms of different ways of looking at funding. So how do you look at self-financing mixes, community financing mixes, and leveraging of what is out there to bring in and generate different types of income? And it really has helped us to look at that then becomes your unrestricted funding. Whereas in the market that we are currently, we do have a lot of restrictions. And with going out and sourcing other income through your financial mixes and your community mixes that we could then build our unrestricted restricted pots. So I think encouraging that, adopting flexible fundraising models and allowing us to use different resources, events, raffles, just one event can raise about 500,000 Rand for an organization like Tomorrow Trust. And that then can also go in and help build our reserves. Also, I think from our perspective is the relationship that you build with your funder is key. With having that trust and that delivery and ensuring that you are continuously delivering and year in and year out, that builds that rapport and that trust to actually get to that point where we could start now advocating for and encouraging, can we put some of this money to reserves? And we have noticed that they are more willing to actually do so because they can see that there's transparency behind it and that the money is going to where we had said it would go. So I think it's very crucial that when you are building a relationship specifically with fundraising is, for me, it's not going out and finding money. It's about building that relationship with that individual. So then later on, we can encourage in advocacy of it's more funding, unrestricted funding, and increasing that network. And again, I think it's very important, specifically in South Africa now, over the last couple of months with the political climate, with a lot of our nonprofits in our environment relying on one source of income. And at that moment, if that has gone, what do you do? And to give you a context within South Africa, our Department of Social Development has cut budgets substantially for a lot of grassroots organizations because of compliance issues, not being transparent, not reporting properly around accounting principles or financial management. And a lot of these organizations have to have closed their doors. And I think from my perspective is that there's a lot of people doing such good work out there, but they do not know how to do the basic reporting because, they are looking after those vulnerable children that need to be looked after within the community. And I think that becomes very critical to show and teach and mentor organizations that are smaller in the capacity around how do you do not rely on just one, but how do you start diversifying and building those relationships and looking at leveraging off a self-financing mix or community mix or other sorts of income that could help sustain organization. And I think it starts with small steps. I mean, I think with all organizations, they want to get to the point where we are so comfortable that we've got reserves. But I do think that it is starting with first understanding where you're at, what your history has been, and where do you want to go around the funding aspects.
Fantastic. That's really encouraging. And yeah, so you've obviously years and years of building those relationships has been what's enabled you to get access to that high quality funding, that unrestricted funding, that flexible funding. But it starts with small steps. That's very encouraging. And you make it sound so easy, but I can imagine it's been really, really a lot of effort and some losses and gains and events that flop, events that really work, and a lot of challenges along the way. I'll come back to a lot of the things that you talked about, Taryn. This is really, really interesting. But I just want to bring in Madonna here with your experience, as you said, of being a grant maker, a philanthropist, an African philanthropist, thank you, which I'm really fascinated to hear about. And I know you've been convening a lot of conversations around this topic. I wonder if you're seeing any shifts in the ways that CSOs are thinking about their relationship with their funders and the ways in which CSOs are sort of interacting with their funders. Are you seeing a shift? We're talking about them feeling more powerful. Are you seeing that in reality? I'd be really interested to know.
Samantha, allow me get back to that in a few. There's something
Absolutely.
It's something that I noticed.
Please, just, yeah, respond to anything.
About the reserve fund and the openness about, how much is within a certain organization's reserves. And I think that the script, going back to the script on funding, has been spending to zero. The higher the burn rate, the better for you. So more money and more continuity in a sense. That has been the trajectory, at least in the Ugandan context in which I operate. And one of the things that we have tested out still within the SIV fund, the Afro-Feminist grant-making arm, has been funding reserves. That has grown over time. So we have something called the Resilience Fund, and it started around as a COVID response fund in a sense. It started around the COVID period with a major donor that pulled out of Uganda, that was the DGF, and it left very many organizations in a rather sorry state, and some of them really just running out of business in a sense. So you can't pay your next month's rent. You're done for essentially because this major donor has pulled out. And in response to this financial resilience fund was established to support these recovering organizations. And the goal here was not to fund activities, but to fund sustainability, such that maybe you're able to fundraise without the fear of being kicked out or evicted by your landlord. To be able to run your programs knowing that your staff have a certain, at least bare minimum of a stipend if the salaries won't come through, that you're able to generate this income. And while navigating or running this fund for the first time, it was important that we offer accompaniment to the first people that receive this, and it has become something that we've done over the years, to offer accompaniment in terms of how you run or manage a fund of this nature. Still, because we were, and when I say we, civil society, pardon my switch between identities, I warned you about the shape-shifting grant maker and also civil society. So because of the indoctrination in just implementing the activities, spending to zero and reporting, it was hard to conceptualize that you can actually have money that you put aside and grow for a certain period of time and use the proceeds from that to sustain yourself as an organization, but also work towards building a reserve that can keep you stable when a donor pulls the rug from under your feet, like DGF did in a sense. So I think it's a very important thing to consider as we think about flipping the script on funding more reserves, but also recognizing the issue of sustainability of civil society, of development work beyond the big donor money that goes mostly to the project implementation and not to the sustainability of the organization. As to the shift that I see happening around civil society and the interaction with funders, I would say that a lot of my lessons have been from the partners of the SIV fund that usually are not the kind of organizations or partners that big donors, say the USAID or bilaterals, would fund. So there's a bit more inclusion, and I think that's why we also advanced the community foundation approach to ensure that more excluded parties in the international development scene are included in this work and in the funding pipeline, in a sense. So one of the shifts that I've noticed is the ability to push back and negotiate. It's something we've lost over time, and it's because of the power, like I talked about. There's this amount of money and the already prescribed ways that you're meant to utilize it in a sense. And you need it because you need your staff to get salaries, you need to advance the work somehow, you need to exist. We're really just in survival mode, I would say. But the pushback has come from exposure to unrestricted, flexible money. So the first time that the partners experience this, they're like, oh, there's actually an alternative to this, and I can actually, in a sense, negotiate with the funder if I'm acceptable about certain terms, and state or create my own donor charter, that these are the things that I stand for, these are the things that I would rather not stand in this relationship. This is my position in a sense. And it has, at least from the feedback from the partners that we've worked with, is because they've been exposed to this flexible funding. And the more that we see the narrative shifts and the change that's happening, I think is greatly advanced by feminist funds, at least from the structure that they have around flexibility, responsiveness, the flexibility in the way that you report, the flexibility in the way that you apply for the grant, the accompaniment that's not very top-down heavy in a sense, but tell us where you're at and we can support you at that rate. That you are vulnerable enough with the donor to say, I've never done a financial report before. This tool, no matter how simple it looks like to you, does not make sense to me. So this is what I'm able to do. Can we work on this together? And that this is something that we also do internally to equip the staff that are working within the fund to extend this kind of support. You know, you're on phone calls with partners. So this is what I've sent you. Take a look at it before I submit it into the system, which was not something that we commonly experienced before. You're supposed to, there's a presumption of knowledge sometimes, but also sometimes where it's not, that's where the intense capacity building approaches come in, where funders have these, you know, multi-day trainings on how to fill out their specific donor tools, the M&E tools, the financial reporting, the narrative reporting tools. And this usually happens at the beginning of the grant, which may not take into account the newest challenges that you may experience while implementing. So because of experiencing this, there's more and more partners that are able to say, you know what, from my experience with a feminist and flexible funder, this is what I'm able to take from a donor. I can say no to certain kinds of money because I know what the cost is to my organization and staff, and work within that. That's some of what I've noticed in my context. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So the experience of having that funding from you actually changes their approach to the conversations with other funders, and sort of imagining what's possible and building their negotiating muscle with that. That's really wonderful. I wanted to ask you, so you're giving flexible funding, but you do require financial accountability. So you have a tool, you expect your partners to fill out what they've spent. Is that right? Is it something that is specific to CSOs Africa that you've developed that's sort of appropriate to your grantees, or what's the format like?
So the narrative, it gets as flexible as possible. It's up to you to submit either a video describing what you did with your work, and it's also incorporated in the application process where there's a section that where you are supposed to describe what success looks like to you. So at the end of it, you're narrating exactly how, if that success was accomplished, and that can take very different forms. For others, it's been, because we deal with a diverse range of partners, it's handwritten in some instances. For some, there's a form for those that want a bit of structure that's also available, but not necessarily restricted to that. For the financial reporting, there's a certain level of accountability that's required. There's a simple form, but there's also an openness for you to use what speaks to you as an organization. But I think Taryn had pointed earlier to it about managing relationships with donors and restating the importance of financial reporting, yet some organizations may not necessarily be at a certain level may not be comfortable with certain kinds of financial reporting. So we need to also acknowledge that, because we find individuals, movements, collectives that are not necessarily registered. They know what they want to do, but they're not, all for the Excel sheets, and also you have to accommodate all of that. So there's a bit of flexibility. You can use a form, you cannot, it's okay. But if you need any other guidance on how to do the basics from your end, there's also support for that.
That's really interesting. So one of the things I wanted to share from our project is that just last month, 28th of May, we published a standard format donor report, like an expenditure report with some standard headings, so that every donor can use the same headings and every organization can do their donor reporting against the same set of headings, so that when we're looking at diversifying, for example, like you were mentioning, Taryn, once you've got one donor and you get one set of codes, that's easy. As soon as you go from 1 to 2, it gets suddenly more complicated. You've got 2 sets of budgets and they're not the same types of headings, and one has got salaries and one's got employment costs, and one wants this joined with that, and the expenditure analysis just becomes this massive admin headache that nobody signed up for, right? So there's been calls out, ever since the Grand Bargain 2015, to have a harmonization of donor reporting formats, and this is what we published last month. It's open for public consultation and feedback, so I really hope that you and all of the people listening will consider having a look at it. But it basically has like 6 headings, and you can have subheadings, but it means that you can set up your accounting system for all donors. The accounting softwares can be set up in a way that helps you generate those reports more easily. The trainings can be harmonized, and we can really help make it easier for especially small organizations that are going from one funding source to many to handle that, so that it's not such a burden. So it's really interesting that you've got that flexibility, Madonna, but many organizations don't, and they require it in this particular way, which can make it tricky. So I just wondered, I'd love to hear your feedback as well, Taryn. What do you think of a harmonized? There are pluses and minuses, right? This is not all joy, but what are your thoughts about a harmonized donor reporting format?
Yeah, I do agree with it. I think it would make life, it would bring everyone on the same playing field, which I think is very important. And I just wanted to echo what Madonna said, is being vulnerable to donors and speaking to them to get an understanding of what their needs are, and like having that available and being able to talk through, so then they can help you position to the best to what their needs are, is very helpful. So even having a harmonized reporting structure would be amazing, and with that added, to consultation with your partner, could actually help to develop it quite out. So I do think it would benefit the sector quite well.
And that openness and transparency, which you talked about right at the beginning, Taryn, it's not about money, it's about trust, it's about relationships, it's about communication. And sometimes the finances can kind of get in the way of that, and it can become this sort of problem in being open. But if people really are able to better understand their finances and build that confidence that you talked about, Madonna, to maybe push back and be more open and be more confident in talking about their finances, that can really help. There was a question earlier about how to build the reserves. This is something that obviously we cover on various training courses, but it would be really great to hear from your experiences on how your own organizations and organizations that you've dealt with actually go about that. Is it unrestricted funding from grantors? Is it this variety of different activities? Doesn't it create tax problems? I don't know. There's a lot of questions around it, and there's some, I think, people in listening in that would be really interested to hear your wisdom and experiences. Taryn, do you want to go first, or Madonna? I don't know.
I don't mind going first. So, sure, I think everybody's searching for the holy grail of reserve building. So initially, when Tomorrow Trust was founded, again, it goes down to relationship building. So having such strong relationships in place that if you're keeping your expenditure low and you have got a surplus, how do you have that conversation, that brave conversation to say, is this okay for me to allocate it to the reserve? The reserve is there to help us continue our vision and mission. It's going to go to other children. Going to go to children or to the vision of the organization. It's just been redirected to a safe pot, right? And we were very successful in doing that, was having conversations with our funders to say, we want to keep our expenditure low, not compromising on our delivery though, because there's a difference.
Mm.
Ensuring that our delivery is still there, that we are still meeting our objectives and still giving equal quality education to our students and learners, but ensuring that if we do have a saving of 10%, that 10% is not going to, anywhere else but into our reserves. And where we had saved a lot of our money was through our operational costs. And that was finding rental space for free, negotiating with a paper supplier to getting resources for free or at a discounted price. Keeping those organizational costs as low as possible was key. And that was how we started building our reserves. We are fortunate to have some reserves available. I think what was great last year with the consultancy through Momentum was to establish what should the reserves breakdown should look like. So what costs make up your reserves, right? And knowing that and understanding what the purpose of reserves is and how it's been allocated can actually give you the confidence to go to a partner and say, well, this is going for salaries for 6 months, so we can help restart the organization should we lose all funding. It's this will go towards a fee towards developing the program should we close our doors. So it's very crucial to understand what exactly your reserves are made up of. Keeping your costs as low as possible. I think, again, relationship building with your funders. And then again, the diversification of your fundraising efforts. So not only just relying on grants, but those small events or community fundraising efforts that you do, is how do you then look at the amount that you've brought in and say, this portion is going to go to direct organizational program costs, and then this is 5% will go towards building my reserves. Those are some of the points at how we have looked at fundraising specifically for our reserves at this point. One thing that we've looked at now, specifically with reserve building, is also interest. So, to interest that we raise is how do we then redirect that to make sure that we then put that into reserves as well.
That's fantastic. So you need quite a lot of financial understanding and infrastructure to be able to do that. Even the things you're saying, I can imagine for a smaller organization that hasn't maybe understood its finances in that way would be harder. So that brings me to a question I think that's come up in here. It's like, somebody mentioned how some of the big funders, USAID, whatever, they do give this NICRA, they do give overheads, but it's really hard for smaller organizations to access that kind of funding. And yet these small NGOs, as the CSOs, as you know, they do the bulk of a lot of the work on the ground. And the question is, how can you balance this? So the organizations that can access the funding, that's great. For those smaller NGOs that are looking to build that financial sustainability, build that reserve, generate these different kinds of funds, what options are there? Maybe Madonna, I'll put that to you.
Okay. So
your experience with your CSOs.
Yes. One thing that I've noticed within the context in which we operate has been the rise of the social enterprise model. First, because our legal context allows for it, as long as you are able to plow back whatever proceeds you receive from the business into the non-profit work that you're advancing. So we've seen a lot of CSOs invest either in find that those things that are sellable, and I use air quotes here, within the existing work that they have. So are you going to put your research behind a paywall because you have a lot of traffic and you realize there's actual market for it? Or are you going to offer capacity strengthening or training facilities because you are seen as an expert in a certain field, and use those proceeds, save those proceeds and use them towards building your reserve? Those are some of the things that we've seen emerge. but there are also those that explore totally different businesses. There's an organization back in Ginger that explored baking because there are not many bakeries in their context, and it sort of caught on, and the proceeds from that were able to keep their shelter open for a bit. They were running a gender-based violence shelter in that regard. The other thing that I see emerging would be the mutual funds, the unit trusts, money markets as an option for the compound interest that they offer. What you need to get one is also really low. That's about 100,000 in Uganda, maybe I don't know how many dollars those are, but you have a really low starting point in order for you to build a mutual fund. That's also something that's a reserve fund, whether that's also something that's being explored. But all of this, and it's important to think about it in line with the law, that you don't get excited as an organization and spend as you please, or the leaders spend as they please, but that there's a structure to plow back the proceeds into the work. Around defining the use of these reserve funds, I see that a lot of them tend to go towards admin costs, that's paying for human resource, paying for rent and things like those, because I think they stand as a backbone for the organization's sustenance or existence. And sometimes it's important to have those in place as you figure out the other ways that you can fundraise to sustain the programs, maybe have rotational or more temporary staff around as you work towards building the admin costs and reserve fund for that purpose. The other goal behind the reserve fund is usually to sustain that part of your work that attracts the most funding, in a sense. That if you can build it to sustain your research work because you're able to make more money out of the research, or attract more donors because of sustaining that element, is also another trend that I've seen. But to the point of diversifying fundraising, and funders, in a sense, for your organization, that's also critical, which has in our context seen the rise of more local resource mobilization. And still back to the theme for today on flipping the script on funding, local resource mobilization has seen the recognition of local resources. I would say that many times when we thought about who can support civil society and our work, we thought external and international aid flowing from the global north and into the global south. But the more that people buy into local fundraising and are able to communicate the work that they do, the impact that they're having to local partners, businesses, is still a stretch, and a lot of work is going into that. I know that the Uganda NGO Forum runs that Change the Game Academy that offers training in local resource mobilization for the NGOs that are part of their membership. We've also done it with the community foundation leaders that we are supporting in order to encourage more community buy-in of their work, such that there's more community investment. So at the point of fundraising, you're not necessarily starting from scratch, and there's a lot of power that can come from knowing you have the backing of people, of the community behind you in these fundraising endeavors. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And it actually also links into our sort of theory of change of developing this accounting standard, is that you see in countries that have their own national standards for how non-profits do their financial reporting, you have accountability, you have transparency, you have trust, you have domestic philanthropy. They all go together. And then in countries like Uganda, where we are, no national standard for how NPOs do their accounting. A lot of the accountability is sort of outsourced to external funders, and the domestic philanthropy is still a growing thing. And you need trust, you need accountability to build the giving, and that domestic giving needs that accountability structure as well. So I think that they all play together, they're all interlinked, and this domestic sort of sources is really, really important. And I think it just, the training course that we've been running as Humantum has these 4 pillars of financial sustainability, and you've both been talking about them all the time. The first is generating unrestricted funding, because without unrestricted funding, you can't build reserves. The second is diversifying your funding mix, making sure you've got some short-term, some long-term, some local, some events, different types. The third is building those reserves, knowing what your target is and putting it aside really deliberately and knowing what you're aiming for and putting it aside. And the fourth is that stakeholder relationships, which Taryn, you've talked about right from the very beginning. You can't do financial sustainability without relationships. It's absolutely sort of tied to that fundamentally. There's one other thing I wanted to pick up, Taryn, that you said about getting donated resources, rent or paper, whatever, these donations in kind, which is a magic skill, a magic superpower of nonprofits. Companies don't get things donated to them, right? This is a superpower of nonprofits. It's people, it's volunteers, it's donated services, donated goods. And yet often we don't put that into our accounts, and it can make our income look smaller than it really is. And it can also skew some of our numbers. So if your admin costs are looking really low because you've got donated services, it doesn't mean they're actually low. It means that they're this big, but you've managed to generate income to cover some of them already. And that tells a different story. So again, this is the sort of accounting niggles and corners that INPAG, this international nonprofit accounting guidance, is providing standardization for, and giving organizations the framework to be able to tell that story and their overhead story in a way that's more transparent and hopefully helps them with this funding and fundraising. There's one last thing I wanted to mention before I throw it back to you for some final comments, that in INPAG there is a definition of fundraising costs, and it specifically talks about the costs of getting grants and donations, the costs of doing commercial type activities like your bakery or anything that you're doing that's just sort of selling things on a more commercial basis to generate money, and the costs of running investments and generating money through the funds that you've talked about. So all those 3 things you've talked about are the 3 sort of categories of fundraising in INPAG as well. So super, it's really exciting to see that resonance. So the last few minutes, I want to hand over to each of you to summarize maybe your top 2 or 3 takeaways from what we've been talking about. We do have until the half hour. Oh, jolly good. I was aiming for the hour and wrapping up. Thank you, Jenna, for correcting me. I would love to open it out for some Q&A. Is there anybody who'd like to put a question to any of us, our panelists, and pop it in the chat? I'd love to see what people out there are thinking, and what things has this ignited in you? What questions has this thrown up for you? I'm just looking through the chat here. Oh, somebody, yes, Nancy. Jenna, are we doing this with putting it in the chat, or do you want to bring Nancy in? Nancy, yes, you're unmuted. Do you want to ask your question?
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists. So my name is Nancy Nkomo. I'm from an organization called Solidaridad, which is an NGO. So I can relate to a lot of the discussion that's taking place. I think the question that I have is for Madonna. And I think it's essentially asking to say, with regards to the dissemination of the funding, which particular models are you using that you found to be more to contribute more to decentralization, right? So say, for example, is it through calls for proposals, or have you found the proactive approach where you are co-designing with your grantees? But which particular models do you guys utilize? I think that would be my question and point of interest.
I don't know, over to you.
Oh, okay. I thought you'd like receive all the questions and answer at once. We've currently only tried the calls for proposals. We haven't gotten into the co-design with the partners, so calls for proposals. Although when it comes to decentralizing, it's, we don't sort of post it on your website or social media and sit with it. It's I know that for one of the art funds, it's decentralized up to the local leaders, like the LC1 in the farthest part of Uganda, I'd say, is able to post it and disseminate it to the individuals, organizations within their context, and not limiting the language in which they submit their proposals. So we have people that are able to translate from the local languages into English for the staff that are not able to understand those languages during the review process. So it's, when it comes to disseminating the calls, we try to go as far and wide as possible, but currently, yeah, we haven't tried the co-design approach. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I can see a question here about overhead rates. I'd love to cover this briefly. So somebody was saying they had an overrate of 45%, 35%, and somebody else is saying that's too high, it's too inefficient. What is your take, and from what you've seen of different, your own organizations and organizations you've seen, is there such a thing as a too high overhead rate, or this is what it should be, or it's such a hot topic and everybody has opinions on it? I'd love to hear from both of you. Maybe we'll start with Taryn, if you have a view on that.
Sure. So from our board's perspective, that is high. As well as from the funders that we work with, it is quite high. Our overhead costs right now is sitting on about 15%. Yeah. But again, I think it's to the credit of our board and just ensuring that we're keeping those costs as low as possible. Yeah. I haven't had any of our partners come back or question it. They have come and actually looked at it and looked for it specifically. Actually, come to think about it, I had about 3 funders in the past come to us and say, have pointed it out and said this is too high, or this is, So I think it is something that we have to look at.
Madonna, what's your experience with some of the smaller organizations? Well, they don't even know their rates sometimes, I guess. But do you have anything to share there?
So for the overhead costs, the times that we give, we call it grants plus. So you can fund activities separately and also able to submit a proposal for the admin costs that they need in order to run a specific project for which they're receiving funding. So that's an option that we're testing out. So it's really dependent on the needs of the organization. Yeah.
So what we've seen at the Impact Project, IFR for NPO, we've been looking at this a lot. And one thing that's come up in the research that actually Humenton did a couple of years ago was that larger organizations have lower overhead rates. You've got economies of scale. So 10, 15, 20 large organizations. Once you get to the smaller organizations, the overhead rate is actually higher. And the middle size is the highest, because you've got all the costs of multi-donor funding. You need the big accounting system. You need to have the policies. You need to have the HR system, because you're big enough that everybody expects you to have that. And yet you don't have the size to make that total cost as a percentage of the whole look lower. So the sizes and the rates are very much interlinked. And the other thing that we found is that there's huge variety because nobody calculates it in exactly the same way. There has been and there is no sort of international standard definition of this is an overhead cost and this isn't. There's lots of different ways to slice it. Some people will put all their salaries as overheads, even if they're project staff. Some will say, well, grant making is, it's not direct delivery, or sub-granting. Where do you put sub-granting? Is that direct? Is it indirect? There's all sorts of different question marks over it. And one of the discussions we've been having about in this transparency is if you do your financial statements and they have to disclose your overheads, that could be great because it gives you a good basis for negotiating, but it could also be a big problem if people are going, oh, 30%, very inefficient. And if it comes with a whole bag of judgment that could be unhelpful and unfair, that could actually result in a kind of race to the bottom, which could be counterproductive. So we're looking at coupling the transparency with the education and really helping people, all different types of people, including funders, to understand those rates. And I can see even here there's some comments similar to what I've just said in the chat. So there's another question in here that I'd love to interrogate. Whether local organizations should try to contract directly with big bilaterals. So we have, organized donors like USAID saying we want to get 25% of our funding to local organizations. They've been trying to make their systems easier. They've been working hard to try and do that. How does that feel from a local organization perspective? And we have some thoughts in the chat about people saying, don't do it, it'll kill you. Go to be a sub first, go through an INGO or a different kind of funder. So I'd just love your take, panelists, on that conversation that's happening there in the chat. Again, Madonna, should we start with you? Have you got thoughts on that?
I think it's a tricky place to be in if I say yes and if I say no, in the sense that if I said let them just transfer directly, it's a bit of a problem in terms of what that would do to the grassroots organizations and the work that's happening at that level in a more organic, freeing, maybe not so structured, but quite effective style. If I say no, let them not sort of channel it directly, then I justify the existence of intermediaries, which is something that's up for debate a lot lately. But I think there's a lot of use in the intermediary, but maybe more local intermediaries, I would say. And I'm rooting for vehicles like the Community Foundation model and more local funds that are cognizant of the context in which they operate, the needs, the capacities of the people and places that they work in, that they form such a buffer for the communities to work in a way that they're more comfortable, in a sense, that it would be very destructive. I mean, if you think about, if any of you have received a grant from a bilateral, what that means for your teams, the amount of hours in capacity strengthening sessions, the rigorous reporting templates, and just the frequent interaction with the program staff on the other end. It seems very micromanaging in a sense. So I'm for really intermediaries standing in between for this one. But in this case, we change who the intermediary is. Less INGO, more local funds within our context. Yeah.
And as you mentioned, lots of accompaniment and lots of contextual, culturally appropriate engagement. And that, so yeah, so the money from the bilaterals, it looks shiny, but it comes with its own cost. Taryn, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I do agree with Madonna. I mean, from our point, I mean, yeah, it's a tough question to answer. So from our point, I mean, there has been moments where we have said, like, yes, we could, but then you have to take a step back and actually think through, the capacity, the current staff, how are we going to deliver? Do we have the skills requirements to actually deliver what we need to? And from that aspect, sometimes we have said no and been comfortable with it, And I think it all depends in terms of where you sit, and it's if you've got the belief that you could gain access, then so yeah, tough question to answer.
Well, I think there is no one answer, is there? It's
yes.
like there's no one size fits all.
Yeah.
So it's not do or don't, but I think it's about being aware of what you're getting into.
Yes.
And make sure you're ready for it, because if you're not ready for it, it can be worse than not having it. And if you are ready for it, great, then let's take out these intermediaries where they're not needed, and get more of the funding flowing directly. Super. Okay. I was wondering if if we could talk maybe a bit about due diligence. Now, this is a thing in terms of part of the flipping the script on funding. One of the areas is you're in your seat as a funder, Madonna, and yours as a grant recipient, Taryn. What's your how do we think we could flip the script? Is there anything that can be done about due diligence? Make it easier. Any thoughts? Or it's just a pain point that needs somebody somewhere needs to fix.
I think
okay, Taryn, do you want to go first?
I'll go. I think from an NGO perspective, from my perspective, is due diligence can be done well and easily if you've got the capacity and the right training and understanding for it. And I do think that lacks within our sector to really equip people with the knowledge and the requirements that is needed to actually go through a due diligence process. But I do think that it is important. It is important to ensure that money is going to the right places, that's been handled correctly, to avoid any sort of misuse of funds and all of that. But again, I think on the other hand, for smaller nonprofits, capacity building, understanding, and really getting to know what is needed for the due diligence process is important, because a lot of people that open up NPOs do it because they have a vision and they've got a calling or a need, to actually want to change society. And a lot of people are called to this to actually make a difference within society. But sometimes you go into it not knowing that there are a lot of things that we have to think about, and I think that's mentorship or capacity building is very important for NGOs, so they can understand and they can actually come to the party and play on the same level as everybody else, is given a fair chance at going through a due diligence process.
That's so true. When you set up an organization, you're full of passion, it feels so hard to then have to sort of prove why you exist and make all this process and all these hoops, and this isn't why I got into this. I want to be doing the work. And yet it is a necessary evil, because there are organizations out there that aren't who they say they are, aren't doing what they say they are. So it's about getting that balance and trying to be ready for it. Madonna, before I say something more about it, what's your take on it? As a funder, I'm sure you have to grapple with this. How do you be a really nice, good local funder and yet not be duped by nonsense that is also out there?
Again, because we're in a place as CSOs of testing, trying, but also refining the practice of philanthropy and funding practices as a whole. It's a very delicate process to undertake, because we try to stay away as much as possible from making it a very extractive, exploitative process, and then afterwards, after making people jump through hoops and loops, feeling like, oh no, we can't work with you. That's something we try to avoid. But I'll take this away from CSOs and state this more broadly. I think one of the things that I've seen from funders that are trying to step away from their due diligence, taking away from their potential partners, they've set aside money it's more expensive, I guess, on their part, or not, I don't know, to give what we call relationship building grants. So you'd call it a test grant, in a sense, that yes, you intend to give out grants of, say, $10,000 to organizations, but instead of giving $10,000, you say, let's start with 2,000 grants, or just a small percentage of that. We test it out for a year, and our relationship with you for a year determines, how we proceed from this point. And many of those that have tried that working with organizations that are not very attractive to the bilaterals, for example. They've existed for less than 3 years, are recently registered, trying to get their policies and procedures and everything else in place. They may not be, they may need a lot of support around financial reporting, narrative reporting, and all these things that mean a lot to you as a donor, but they're really great at the work. But the structure and all is something that's still a work in progress. So I think that in all the things that I've had, that has been the most more human approach to due diligence, that you approach it in a way that does not take away from the partners that you are courting, in a sense, or wooing, but you give back and allow that relationship to grow, and you learn all these things, and maybe you work with them and not sort of dumping it and dumping the money on them and saying, you know, we expect our financial reports and all, but still providing accompaniment. And the responsiveness to that process can determine a lot. Maybe the person or the organization doesn't get it right the first time, but there's a certain willingness to learn, and there's a certain growth within that period that you worked with them that could justify deeper and more investment and partnership with them. That would be my take on that.
Wow, that really does sound like flipping the switch. So rather than here's the list of documents, tick, 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 it's here's a grant to help us start a relationship, to build that trust that Taryn, you spoke about, which is actually what it's fundamentally about. And focusing, as somebody else has said in the chat, focusing on what they're doing in the first instance. And then there's a sort of passage for growth, because once the money gets bigger and the donors get more institutionalized, there does become a need for that proper, you know, more sort of rigorous due diligence. And there is a space for that. But at the grassroots level, at this beginning relationship level, to be able, and smaller amounts to test the water. That sounds really fascinating. So again, with this IMPAG project, one thing that we've done with our donor reference group is we've said, when you look at the financial statements and when you're doing your due diligence, what do you look for? And we got a lot of their sort of checklist points, and into IMPAG, we've now made it a requirement that some of those things go into your annual audited accounts. So that rather than say, here's my annual audited accounts, and then they also need to ask for X, Y, Z, A, B, C, da, 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 quite a lot of the information that you would expect to find in a credible professional set of audited accounts is there already, reducing the need for, oh, and please can I, and can you send, and who's this, and who are your board members, and blah, blah, blah. It's all in one place in your audited accounts. Again, the idea is to try and make that process a little more harmonized, a little more, a little easier. And I know that it's something that Humentum is really advocating for, and there are international efforts to harmonize due diligence approaches, again, to make this just a smoother ride. I can see Florence has had her hand up patiently. Florence, you want to come in? What's your question?
Sure. Hi, everybody. This is a great conversation. Actually, I just wanted to make a couple comments. So I do work with USAID currently. Don't hate on me. No. No hate. I know this is a safe space, but I am actually quite realistic. And I dropped a couple comments in there about the realities. And, you know, there's a joke, actually. We know we're like one of the toughest donors to ever work with, right? We make it so hard. And it's like a joke. Well, it's not even a joke that if you can, you know, receive funding from us and complete your program, you could work for anybody, right? Like, it's our compliance and our risk. And I guess, you know, it's interesting because I've also worked with INGOs, the big ones. I've also worked with local partners. I lived in Tanzania for 12.5 years and supported many local partners. So I think luckily I have the perspective like from every single realm, right? Which is amazing. And, you know, even I volunteer to support local organizations, youth-led organizations, right? Because that's where you were saying passion and the magic lives, but like I dropped in there, it doesn't keep the lights on, right? So how do you, you know, help them? And I think that USAID, you know, we're slow, right? And we have so many government requirements that, you know, do prevent us, but we are making changes. And I think that we are actually holding our prime partners, the big INGOs, more accountable to actually strengthen capacity of the sub-awardees, right? So we call them local partners, right? But that's the thing, is that not every local partner wants to become a prime. Like someone had mentioned, they like that umbrella, because I've been a chief of party for USAID projects, and English is my first language. The reporting was insane, right? Like everything, right? Like whether it's financials or annual reports or work plans or this, and they're lengthy documents and have to be in X format, or you get yelled at, not really yelled at, but I wanted to say that as an agency, we are, we're trying to be forward leaning as much as we can in our governmental structure, right? Because our Congress has mandates and restricted funding, and I think we try to move the needle on compliance and risk, and it's extremely hard though, right? Because American tax dollars, right? Even though it's the smallest percentage of our whole US government budget, international development, but the most Americans do not know that, right? So I think that we constantly have that pressure, but I think in our missions throughout the world, we have like 86, I think now, that is contextual, right? Working with our local partners. And there is the want from like USAID staff to actually work more with them. And it just sometimes our own, where it's like inflicted things within our agency, but it is all about relationship building, right? Like when you go out to the field and you visit your projects, whatever that is, right? Like for me, it's youth farmers, right? That's where I get the magic. I get engaged and we're like, what do you need, right? Like what would help you be successful? Or as a new partner, like what are your pain points? Because there's so many, right? Like, what are the pain points of working with us, or why would you want to work with us, right? Like sometimes I'm like, no, don't do it, right? But I think, I just wanted to share that from like this perspective. And I'm so realistic, right? And I always talk to like my colleagues. I'm like, why would you do this? Like, this does not make sense for anybody, right? So, oh, I'm sorry. There's some questions in here about, I didn't mean to draw questions, but yeah, I'll draw things in the chat. But I just wanted to come on here and say that I get it. It's super hard. We're trying to move the needles, but sometimes, I mean, I prefer working on like as a partner implementer side, right? Because it's easier, but you also where more of the magic happens. But just wanted to share those thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Florence. And it's great. I think this is really, really interesting because we're seeing like the standard models getting better and donors like USAID sort of changing the language and changing the patterns. We're also seeing completely new models. And like, we don't need to always go to the USAIDs, even on the other funders, even if they're improving their practices and it's getting easier and better. There's all these other things that we can open our minds to think about as well, which is really cool. So we are into our last few minutes. So I'd love to give each of you a sort of, chance to wrap up. What are some of your key takeaways from our conversation today? And then finally, we'll hand it back to Jenna to close. So Madonna, can I ask you first, what are some key bullet points and takeaways from our conversation today?
Thank you, Samantha and Himanshu, for the opportunity to share my thoughts in this series of conversations. And my key takeaway point is around if we are advancing a movement-led systems change agenda, I think there's people that we've left out of this conversation. And I shared with Samantha earlier, before we got into this call, how a lot of the flipping the script on funding discussions that have been happening globally seem to be very program officer centered, I would say. There's a lot of advocacy that goes in that. It may cover all these things that we've talked about here, but I feel like many times when we have these conversations with our finance team, for example, they're like, oh, what's that locally led, how does it get trickle down to us in a sense? That's a you problem. That's you and your English usually. So this session and even just focusing a lot on the different ways of accounting, different ways of financial reporting, or getting something more central that can speak to more NPOs has opened my eyes to people that need to operationalize locally led development and the need for them to be a part of this discussion. I was going to pose and ask, by a show of hands, how many of us here are accountants joining this call? Because usually there's no time to in between. Yes, Samantha. Yes. But I feel like it's really a space that we haven't tapped into a lot beyond the program officers, but this has been critical. At least I have a lot to take back to the finance team and encourage them with evidence that this conversation is about them and it's not about the program officers in this case. And the other is that it's a reflective process. We build and we refine as we go. Left with a lot of thoughts, especially around building reserves and what makes sense within our context, and refining our due diligence processes as an organization, but also to look at this deeply in a way that's not extractive, but gives back power to the partners that we are pursuing. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Madonna. I was going to ask people if there are any accountants to put a thumbs up or something in the reactions. If you go more and then reactions, you could do a thumbs up if you're an accountant. And I love that, you know, as part of this project, we've created a community of non-profit accountants, because when the non-profits get together to talk about these things, the accountants aren't part of the conversation. And when accountants get together globally, they're not talking about non-profits. They're talking about companies and investments and return on, you know, all that kind of corporate stuff. That's what accountants mostly talk about. So it's been really fun managing this project, which I've been directing for the last 5 years. And you find the finance people like, oh, my people, you speak my language, you understand my reality, because finance people are often quite siloed within their organizations. So if you're out there and you're a finance person feeling this pain of trying to be a professional accountant in this space, and yet it feels like nothing really fits and it's hard to apply, please visit the project website, www.ifrfornpo.org. Jenna put it in the chat earlier. And if you want to engage your finance people, as Madonna's just said, this is a conversation that they should feel part of. The accountants are more than just complying and posting the transactions and churning out the reports and ticking the boxes. They can really be part of this transformation, because financial accountability is at the heart of some of this power shift stuff that we have to work on. It's the kind of stuff that nobody really wants to talk about because it's a bit technical and complicated, but it's really, really at the heart of it. Thank you so much for that, Madonna. And Taryn, some final takeaways for you.
Yeah, Sam, I mean, I think you hit the nail on its head there, because I do think that accounting principles, your financial management, is one of the little legs that hold your fundraising efforts together. And I think also one thing that I'm taking away from this as well, and it's just struck me again, is humanizing funding. Remembering that there are people on the other side, and we have to approach it with understanding, compassion from that aspect as well. And I think trust becomes an integral part of that, and that is through making it human, you know. So relationship building, putting that in and building those partnerships will enable, and that comes through recognizing that we're working with people. So yeah, those are my takeaways. Thank you for having me.
That's so wonderful. And it's so easy for us as part of these conversations to sort of stereotype, and there's the donor and there's the local organization, and we kind of imagine, and we can be actually we can become a bit prejudiced in our kind of own ways of thinking about some of these patterns, and to remember that there are people behind every single organization, and 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, they want to do the right thing and they're trying to work hard to make things work. And yet we're all in this system that seems to be a bit stuck, and it's trying to move, but we can't all move together in the same direction, and it's not quite clear where to move to. But coming in with so much goodwill and coming in with that humanity that I loved what you said at the beginning, that feminist sort of mindset, Madonna, and coming into bringing that into all our conversations is going to be so transformational, because all these conversations are knotty and difficult. We can't have them without that human touch. Thank you, Taryn. That's fantastic. So Jenna, last 5 minutes, I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you so much. Let me just say that first, to both Madonna and Taryn. Thank you so much for bringing your thoughts and experience and wisdom and insights to this conversation. It's been really, really enjoyable.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you to both the panelists. I'm going to drop in the chat now some links for next steps that you can take if you enjoyed this conversation. So we're having the next webinar in this series at the end of September. So that first link, you can follow that and register for the rest of the series. If you're a Humentum member, we offer monthly convenings and roundtables to really dive into all of these different topics. So feel free to register for those. Also have put in an update, our newsletter link if you want to stay up to date with the work that we're doing and other convenings like this. And finally, once again, putting in the IFR for MPO project. Please definitely, if you found this interesting, stay up to date with that. Sam's doing really, really great work there. So really loved this conversation and was really happy to be a part of it. And thank you all to everybody. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Have a good day.